the idea is that we would do this session called Science Fiction Urbanism. That Geoffrey West, distinguished professor from Santa Fe Institute, would talk about science. I would talk about fiction, and Bjarke will talk about urbanism. So without further ado, we're going to get into it. So I'm going to, can we go to the slides? I'm just going to stand over here. So I'm going to show some of the work from Inaba and also from C-Lab, which is a research arm at Columbia that I have that develops stories, essentially, the content for stories. And so with it, we do things like this magazine. We co-edit a magazine called Volume, and each issue is based upon a theme. This one is the idea of how architects could almost do nothing as a way to create urban spaces. Another one that we did right after that is on social engineering. Thereafter, one on leaks, buildings that leak, environments that leak, and also buildings that leak information. In 2006, we tried to come up with a scenario that would be impossible to happen. So we came up with this idea of a housing crisis that would require federal intervention to save it. We did one on hope, one on counterculture. Stuart Brand and Kevin Kelly are in it, among others. The last one was on using the moon as a source of inspiration for environments on Earth. And then one of the ones that we did recently was actually on fiction, and the way to use fiction as a way to talk about architectural realities today. So in one of the articles, it's a collection of images by Neil Denari, which talks about overstimulation in cities, and the fact that overstimulation requires times where you need metabolic downloads, like in Tokyo, and that potentially density creates drowsiness, and the possibility for new kinds of personal space within the public, like ones where bodily distance from one another isn't really that important, or also apparently personal belongings are not important either, as you can tell from the guy up on the top. We also did an issue on power, the power of individuals to make changes within regions. And so we looked at different aspects of power, like what makes a powerful leader, such as good hair. This is the standing US senators in the US. And then we thought, what if you could combine different attributes of power and use them to develop figures that could intervene in different parts of the world? So for example, could you have a Saudi eco-dictator that would initiate scalable R&D and environmental technology in the Gulf? Or could you have a tribal populist real estate mogul who would be able to protect the interests of the middle class against predatory lending and property ownership rights? Some of these ideas of fiction we try to apply in real projects. So this is a project that we're doing for the city of New York, where we're trying to look for private-public partnership initiatives and where investment can go, where capital investment could be driven in the city. So one of the things that we looked at were the most stable, traditionally the most stable neighborhoods in New York, which are the middle class. And so this is a kind of GIS analysis of where the middle class is in New York. So if you just take it by household income, the black area is where the middle class are. If you look at things like personal income, you get areas like this that are a little bit more reduced. If you look at people who make less than $25,000 a year, you get an even smaller area. If you think about people who own homes, that increases the area of the middle class to a figure like this. But then again, if you take away the people who are over 65 who tend to spend less, that the area of the middle class is less. If you add on dependents, it gets smaller. If you look at people who have only in high school education, it gets smaller still. So if this is the broadest scope of what the middle class is, and this is the minimum in terms of what our alternative definitions are, then these gray areas are areas that we're thinking about for investment as a way to stabilize urban growth in New York. So in a similar way, we try to apply these ideas to conditions in Los Angeles. This was for an exhibition on planning in Los Angeles. This is the Hollywood sign. It was done for an area in Los Angeles, which is sort of like any other hillside in Hollywood, topographically in terms of access. It's no different than any other area along that stretch of land. But because the sign is there, the real estate value of this area has increased extraordinary compared to the areas around it. And those property values are pretty much insured now that 70 years has passed since the Hollywood land area was first developed. So in that sense, it's sort of obsolete, and our proposal was to develop other areas of Los Angeles that potentially some of the letters could be leased out. So for example, in other areas where there aren't really distinctive identities to a neighborhood, that those areas could be things that are rethought in terms of borrowed letters, depending on the number of letters that you can buy or rent. And then so lastly, I'm just going to show a few stills from a fiction that we did that takes place in the future that was inspired by low-budget science fiction movies. It's called Moore's Law Meets Sustainability. And the premise of the story is that what if research and technology into environmental sustainable technologies took place at such a rate that it began to approximate Moore's Law? If that was the case, then potentially the net consumption of architecture would decrease, and in that case, urbanization wouldn't be a situation where architecture is depleting resources and polluting the environment. Rather, it would be an issue of resource development and remediation, environmental remediation. So you know that the kind of rule of thumb in terms of cities is that what you want to do is densify as a way to lower transportation costs and increase the amount of green space. If you increase the amount of space so that you can create even more green space so that there's more of a heat seek effect reduction, that's even better. And so what we proposed in this was to lift buildings off the ground and to what we called create more space. So to do this, what we do is we're working with ARUP, with the Environmental Technology Group in Los Angeles, to develop a hydrogen conversion system. So solar and wind energy is used to generate electricity. Water is added to the electricity to create hydrogen through hydrolysis. That hydrogen could be stored and then used at a later point when the energy was needed, because the main problem with alternative technology today is just how to store it. And then this would be applied to our buildings. This one suspiciously looks like Allianz Stadium here in Munich, where PV panels would be applied to the building and that the exterior skin of the building would rotate as a way to capture wind energy. That would be stored as electricity and then into hydrogen, and then the hydrogen would be wrapped in helium. And the helium and the hydrogen together would allow lift to occur with the buildings. So the idea is that these buildings would then be clustered together to create cities. And the idea is that these clusters would be expandable or contractible. So in the summertime, the buildings would expand further apart from one another as a way to create shade. And as they get shade on the ground, and as they get more sun exposure, they generate more energy. And as they generate more energy, they lift up higher off the ground to cooler temperatures, which reduces the amount of energy that they need to consume. Whereas in the nighttime, they contract together as a way to protect the heat gain that they gain during the day. So the idea then would be that these cities of the future would be one where you'd have new infrastructure in the sky that would feed down and provide energy to old infrastructure on the ground. Today, buildings consume about 30% of all electricity, and they generate 60% of all the CO2 that's emitted. Our idea with Moore's Law Meets Sustainability is that more energy would be generated, and of the energy that would be generated, less would emit carbon dioxide via buildings. So this is some of the work that we do. I'll give it over to Geoffrey West now.
Thank you. So I'm going to take off from where Geoffrey left, in a sense, and I'm going to talk about a science of cities and corporations. And if I could have the first one of my slides, please. So I put it in the context of sustainability and a very big picture of sustainability. Is all of this actually sustainable? All of this meaning everything we do in terms of our lifestyle, our standard of living, and so on? Or is it just some blip in evolutionary history, in a little experiment that was a failure. And what we realize is that urbanization is the dominant process that has been going on in this planet for the last 200 or 300 years. The developed world is 80% urbanized. The planet is more than half urbanized. By 2050, 80% of the planet will be urbanized. And all of the problems we're facing, from global warming to environment to financial markets, risk, disease, energy, resources, have their origin in urbanization. And the reason that we feel a tsunami of these is coming is because this has been happening at an exponential rate. So critical, this is my provocative statement, unless we develop a serious, integrated, comprehensive, scientifically based, quantitative, predictive theory of cities and corporations, we will not make progress. And so I don't believe that simply the free market system of itself can solve these problems. And I should say in that regard, I'm going to try to make as many provocative remarks in this talk as I possibly can. So here are the questions I want to set this in terms of. Are cities and corporations, companies, somehow biological? We use it. I've heard in just the last 24 hours, ecology, the ecosystem of Silicon Valley, the DNA of a company, the metabolism of a city. Is that just bullshit? Or is there something serious there that we can put into a scientific framework? And as a subsidiary question, can we understand why almost all cities that have ever been formed are still with us? We know there are exceptions, but all companies die. This is a general rule. No companies that have ever been formed in the last 1,000 years have not died or in the process of dying. So can we develop a theory to understand this so that we could have predicted when GM was going to fail and when Google is going to die? So that's the kind of idea and the framework. So the question is this just another version of this? This, in terms of the kind of theory I'm going to talk about in the next few minutes, we understand. This may look like some arbitrary mess when you walk through a forest. This is extraordinarily systematic and has extraordinary structure, so much so that there are formula for how many trees of a given size there are, how much energy is flowing through each branch, how many leaves each tree has, the distribution of sizes, etc., etc. Any question you want to ask about that can be answered, and the question is, can we do the same for this, including the various companies that sit inside those buildings? Life is scalable. Here's mammals. We sit in that. It goes over 100 billion size scale, from the smallest to the largest, doing the same thing. In fact, when you start at the top here, this is the molecules. This is a cartoon of the molecules groups that create your energy, and there are 1 million of these in each cell, these little engines in each cell. They have to scale up to make things like this and this, which scale up to make things like this and this. So this energy ultimately drives cities and your corporations, and it is done in a scalable, systematic way. Is this sustainable? So I'm going to talk briefly about growth. There's growth. So are these related? These are software companies in Silicon Valley. This is what we want. Can we go on doing this? Well, no. We know there are many examples, and so one of the other things I'm going to talk about briefly is death. And here's the route into it. It turns out, despite the extraordinary diversity and complexity of organisms, if you look at any quantity associated with them, any physiological quantity, any life history event, it scales, meaning if you look at different sizes in an extraordinarily simple way. So here's a fundamental example, metabolic rate. How much energy do each of you need, you meaning any mammal or any organism, per second to stay alive? And you plot that versus the size, and this is a logarithmic plot. It goes up by factors of 10, 1, 10, 100, and so on. And here we are. You see, all you need is a light bulb. Your 2,000 calories a day is a light bulb. That's all you need. You're extraordinarily efficient. To stay alive the way you are now living, you require 11,000 watts, not 100 watts. And 11,000 watts is bigger than a blue whale. Each one of you in this room is effectively acting as a blue whale. These kinds of systematic plots go across any variable you want to look at. anything. Your lifespan, your heart rate, how much oxygen diffuses across your lungs, anything. And this one is a bit busy. The extraordinary thing about this graph is not only do we all scale, no matter what you look at, but that you scale in a way that is non-linear, meaning, in this particular case, systematically, the bigger you are, the less energy you need to support a unit mass of the same tissue. So there's an extraordinary economy of scale, and that's the hieroglyphics in this slide. But what it says is there's one mammal, and all of us, all of you, every human being that's existed, every dog, cat, mouse, giraffe, despite appearances, is a well-defined, mathematical, non-linear version of that one mammal. You tell me the size, I can tell you at 90% level everything about it. Everything. That is, including even how much blood is flowing in the 9th branch of its arteries, how long it will live, how long it takes to mature. And the reason for this, mathematically, is that we are all networks. All of us are networks. And here's pictures of various networks at all levels. That's inside the cell, that's inside the mitochondrion, and the question is, are these kinds of networks similar to this, to these biological networks? So here's the summary of biology. We have this extraordinary, universal kind of scaling. We have extraordinary economies of scale, systematically. The pace of life, which I didn't talk about, systematically gets slower and slower. Your heart beats slower than a dog's, systematically. But an elephant's heart beats even slower, and it's systematic across all of life, the pace of life. The growth, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, you grow and then you stop. Well, that's very bad if you're a company or a city or an economy. And as I said, and I'm going to talk about that. So the question is any of this true of cities and companies? So here's a simple plot, the same thing for gas stations, petrol stations across Europe. And you see, they scale. You tell me the size of a city. In Spain, I can tell you how many gas stations it has approximately. But that's true of everything. Everything about a city, every metric you want to think of, it scales like in biology. So here's some examples. Wages, number of super creative people like you lot. Scale. You tell me the size, I'll tell you roughly how many there are in Buffalo, New York, or in Dresden. Okay, here's what's extraordinary about this, in addition, is this exponent, the slope of this is bigger than 1, meaning it goes the opposite way to biology. Biology was bigger you are, the less you have. In cities, the bigger you are, the more you have. Higher wages, systematically, more fancy people, more patents are produced, more police, more taxes, more construction, more debt, total crime. You notice Japan, this is worldwide, with the same slope, meaning to the same degree. So that, and there they are, all plotted together. That's GDP, crime, patents, income, they're all the same. So there's an integrated kind of framework that the good, the bad, and the ugly come together. If you double the size of the city from 40 to 80,000, from 2 million to 4 million, it doesn't matter what, systematically you will increase income, wealth, number of patents, number of colleges, number of creative people, police, crime, AIDS cases, you name it, all by about 15%. All comes together in a package, and the pace of life systematically, necessarily, in this framework of networks, gets faster, systematically. And here's an amazing graph of walking speed in European cities systematically getting faster, the increasing slope. Okay, so all these things that we talked about are not independent. They are, in the lingo, coupled, complex adaptive systems with all of the problems they have, but you cannot consider these independently. So we need an integrated framework, and the reason, as I said in the beginning, this framework leads to this accelerating aspect of city life, social economic life, and that's why we have the problem. We are accelerating at a exponential rate.
Geoffrey?
Yeah.
The 10 minutes is out now.
Okay, let me finish up here. Is this sustainable? So I'm just going to say, I'll take 1 or 2 minutes and finish up. Here's biology, symbolically. You grow and stop. Sorry, you grow and stop. And here are cities that go on, they're expanding. The dimensionality of space continually increases due to wealth creation and innovation, but it has built into it the fact that eventually it will collapse. You have boom busts and collapse, and what you have to do to sustain that is that you have to, the only way to sustain that is that you have to continually reset the conditions by making a major innovation. You discover coal, you discover IT, something that changes it. But the theory demands that this happens faster and faster. So something that took 5,000 years to develop 20,000 years ago, the same thing would take 20 years now. And in 20 years, that's going to take 10 years. So eventually, you're on this accelerating treadmill, and it cannot be sustained. So I'm just going to flash these on and finish. So here's the good. These are the things we like, driven by the economy. This is the bad. This necessarily comes with it. It's entropy, for those that know a little teeny bit of physics. It's entropy production. And all of these things necessarily come with it. And the question is that the final state of the planet? Very likely. Or is it this? And that's the question. And what I'm not going to talk about, because I didn't leave time, is why companies die. Why, and can we predict the death of Google and Microsoft? So I'll finish there, and I apologize.
You can say like architecture is sort of an art form, and therefore is always a lot weaker. And please bring the slides on. Is therefore quite often a lot weaker than science. Can you please show the slides? Essentially, like, what I find quite kind of interesting with Geoffrey's and Geoffrey's angle on urbanism and architecture is this idea that I believe that what we architects do is that we design ecosystems, like economical and ecological systems, that channel not only the flow of people through our cities and buildings, but also the flow of resources. This is a photo taken from the COP15, the United Nations Conference on Climate Change. And as you can see, it wasn't exactly a party, like the Bundeskanzler, Sarkozy. It was like a total failure. Because like none of the goals that were set to reach were actually reached, because like the whole notion of sustainability was sort of drowning in this sort of general idea that sustainability is a question of like how much of our quality of life are we prepared to sacrifice in order to become sustainable. Essentially, this sort of Protestant idea that it has to hurt to do good, or like simply that sustainable life is less fun than normal life. So we thought, like, what about a more sort of competitive standpoint for sustainability? What if sustainability is the art and science of sort of increasing the quality of life? We did the Danish Pavilion for the Shanghai Expo, where we tried to sort of reintroduce the joy of actually biking through the city instead of sitting in a traffic jam or inhaling smog. Also, in a city like Copenhagen, our harbor water has become so clean that you can swim in it. So we try to allow the Chinese to experience on their own bodies how clean, if not how cold, the Danish harbor water is. And sort of to sort of work with this element of scale, that like when things go bigger, you can enjoy different sort of forms of symbiosis. We did a project called The Mountain in Copenhagen, where we put an apartment building on top of a parking structure, transforming the building into a mountain of homes, where each apartment actually has a garden the same size as the apartment itself, and it forms this sort of man-made mountain of suburbia. And finally, in a project called The 8 House, we try to sort of merge shops, offices, townhouses, and apartments into this three-dimensional mixture, almost like a three-dimensional urban city, where not only does it allow each program to gravitate towards its ideal position in the mix, it also expands public life and the possibility for spontaneous social encounters to actually populate the three-dimensional space of the city. You can say, rather than being restricted to occurring on the ground floor, in this case, you can actually get to interact with your neighbors. Your kids can run down and play with their friends, even though they're actually living on the 10th story penthouse. So this sort of idea of like exploiting quantities, we've taken to sort of a new extreme in a master plan we did for, it's also on the edge of Copenhagen, so you have this sort of clash of cultures. But in a project called the Loop City, where we essentially look at the metropolitan Copenhagen and southern Sweden and propose to, it's the most densely populated part of Scandinavia. And we're proposing this sort of loop, turning it into a metropolitan loop that doesn't only combine public infrastructure, but also resource management, resources, energy, even some tax systems that's going to fuse it into sort of a binational metropolitan region. By doubling the scale of the city, we should, according to Geoffrey's theories, be able to increase the economic output with 15%. It becomes like a new metropolitan region the size of the San Francisco Bay Area. And the general idea is to create this sort of infrastructure that is both like ecologically and economically and socially profitable. And this could sound like a sort of science fiction, but just to show you like a project that is fresh off the press, a competition we have just won in Copenhagen, for like a waste-to-energy plant. In Denmark, essentially 96% of all our waste is turned into either recycled goods or power. So we have this sort of ecosystem where our trash actually turns into heat and electricity. This is what they look like. So basically the job was to sort of create this waste-to-energy plant in the middle of the historical city of Copenhagen. It would be the biggest building in all of Copenhagen and the tallest. It would be visible from, this is the opera, the Royal Theatre, and this is where it's going. And it's going to be located in the port where you already have social programs like go-kart tracks or like a marina or even this cable track where water skiers go. So speaking of skiing, Danes, they happily commute 8 hours to go to Branäs in southern Sweden, where you have a silly 150-meter ski slope. Whereas, our building would be 100 meters tall. So you can say, like, in Denmark, we don't have mountains, but we have mountains of trash. So the basic idea was to take Branäs and put it on the roof of this structure. So essentially, like looking at the machines, the chimney becomes the peak. Some like visitor facilities actually allows, the sort of transplant of Branäs. We can take the elevator up along the chimney and have a green, a blue, and a black slope, even a mogul slope, going down to the foot of the elevator. So essentially, you get this sort of social landscape on the roof of this factory, even with an ice skating ring and some cross-country skiing. In the summer, it's an Italian sort of a product that combines AstroTurf with padding. So you can actually have bikini skiing in the summer. And in the winter, we actually have 4 months of snow. Like Denmark has the climate for skiing, but we don't have the topography. And finally, sort of course, the facade of the structure is proposed as a green facade, this sort of modular facade of planters, where all the water that drains from the facade is becoming this sort of a natural filter for daylight. And as a sort of last element, you can say this sort of notion of designing cities and buildings as ecosystems. Not only does the building itself, it collects rainwater, it exploits heat, but it also plugs into the city and turns all of Copenhagen into a single ecosystem. As a sort of last symbol of this sort of idea of hedonistic sustainability, the chimney of the power plant expands to become the roof of a restaurant at the top. It contains a chamber that fills up with smoke. And when you have 200 kilos of CO2, this chamber compresses and blows a giant smoke ring. So you and you can say sort of course, like you can use this smoke ring to communicate with the city. But in general, I like this idea that one of the sort of main drivers of behavioral change is knowledge. And since smoke is this uncountable entity, it's kind of hard to see what's going on. When I was a kid, my parents would tell me when you saw a lighting flash, then you would count to 1, 2, 3, and then the lighting would be a kilometer away. Now you can tell your kids that when you count 5 smoke rings, it's a ton of CO2. So basically, with this sort of this smoke ring as the ultimate sign of hedonistic sustainability, to turn the chimney, which is the symbol of the problem, into something playful, could be sort of a step towards what we like to call sort of a pragmatic utopia, which sort of applying some of this sort of quantifiable knowledge about the city as a living organism, is essentially like the basic idea of turning, like the ambition of turning the city into a socially, economically, and environmentally perfect place into sort of a pragmatic utopian master plan.